Hello, welcome to today's presentation, Finding the Secret Sauce, which is about the portability of regression models. I'm Kevin of Keen Mass Appraisal Consulting. IAAO recommends using the sales approach for residential properties. Yet, a recent survey reveals that the vast majority of counties and municipalities in the United States do not use regression models for valuation of residential properties. This session is intended for anyone who is not currently, but is considering using regression models, especially prepackaged models or models adapted from one jurisdiction to another for mass appraisal. Are models portable? Is it possible to take a model that was written for one market or submarket and use it in another market? Several years ago, I had a conversation with a good friend. He was asking if it was possible to build a model that would run if we plugged in pretty much any data set. After all, there are attributes that appear in almost every model. So why not? Well, sure, it is possible. Isn't that what the large AVMs do? I have a modeling workshop that teaches students to evaluate data, write different kinds of transformations, build and run an additive and multiplicative model, and evaluate the model's performance. I use a controlled data set that produces predictable results. At the end of that workshop, I invite trainees to plug their own data files in and try working through the process. I've also done this myself using data files from other jurisdictions. And it works, meaning it doesn't crash or throw errors. Sometimes I even get great results, but if it is possible, is it advisable? To answer this, we need to understand how models work and what they produce. To the uninitiated, models can look a lot like magic. Data goes in, values come out. Anybody ever learn a card trick? If you follow the steps, you can make the trick work, but maybe you didn't really understand how or why the trick worked. That sound familiar? One of my favorite shows was Arrested Development. Remember this guy, Job? Well, Job was a magician who got blackballed by the Magicians Union for exposing how tricks were done. In this presentation, I'm going to be taking the part of Job. Now, many years ago, a group came into our office trying to sell us a modeling service, and they were talking about models that they had developed. Did we know, said the main presenter, that if you plant a tree in the yard of your home, the value of your home would increase by $125,000? Well, that was pretty impressive, huh? Now, given that the median home price in our market at that time was about $75,000, this didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. How could I go to a nursery, buy a tree for $300, plant it, and almost triple the value of my home? Yet, as I looked around the room, I could see that some of my colleagues were buying this. Now, today, I would recognize immediately that the tree planting was a proxy for something else that was missing from the data file. Probably property condition, because you don't spend your money planting trees in your yard if the ceiling in your dining room is falling down, or if your kitchen looks like something from the Civil War. I'd also recognize that there was a bias in this model because the model was sponsored by a horticultural society. But what this person had done was build an additive model and was suggesting that an adjustment from that model that was written for some county in Florida could somehow be applied to our market. Does that seem preposterous? Well, what about when attributes perform differently in one market versus another? Would you expect that pools and air conditioning would perform the same if I wrote a model for Phoenix and then tried to use that model in Minneapolis? Attributes that are important in one market may be insignificant in another. While both models might include the same attributes, the significance and adjustments will probably be very different. I've read lots of articles in newspapers and magazines that basically say, installing a new kitchen will increase the value of your home by $60,000 or 12%. Well, is it really that simple? Doesn't it matter what neighborhood you're in or what your home is currently worth? Another one that I see a lot is using adjustments for building square footage. Putting in on an addition will add $150 per square foot of value to your home. Rates per square foot are really specific to the models that they are drawn from. Even on a cost approach basis, the land values, material costs, labor costs are going to be different. So the adjustments should vary from market to market. Now, these are all examples of magical thinking. Somebody, somewhere, has something that we believe can be universally applied. So how do models work? Sales models basically will deconstruct sale prices for properties among any number of different attributes. And then we'll estimate the contributory value of each attribute and apply those estimates to other properties that have those same attributes. So here's an example. In this example, we have location, building size, lot size, design of the property, and garage type in the sales file. The model will develop a set of constants and coefficients that are used to estimate how much each attribute affects price, and use those constants and coefficients to predict values for properties that did not sell that have those same attributes. Now we have to understand that the appraisal industry, whether you're talking about mass appraisal or fee appraisal, presumes that there is a direct relationship between attributes and price or value. If I know the attributes of a property, I can predict a price or value. Now this is a critical concept. In my experience, all markets have segments or submarkets where the relationship between attributes and price or value is broken. So just take a moment and think about your own market. And are there circumstances or conditions under which this might be true? So what about when somebody buys a property for demolition? They buy a perfectly good property for the purposes of demolishing that property and building something new. So in that circumstance, do the attributes of that property that they're buying really matter? Do they care if it has 1 bathroom or 2 bathrooms or what kind of shape the kitchen's in? No, because they're just going to destroy the property anyway. So the attributes of the property really may not have anything to do with the price. What about if you buy a prestigious property or a property that's stigmatized? So as an example, many years ago, we saw in one of our more expensive Philadelphia neighborhoods, somebody spent about $500,000 more on a property than we would have expected. And when we looked into it, it turns out the property had one time been owned by the famous author Pearl Buck. And somebody really wanted that property and was willing to pay a whole lot above the market for that property. And in that circumstance, the important thing was that it was Pearl Buck's house. Did they really care about the other attributes of the property? Well, probably not. What about when either the buyer or seller are under duress? In those kinds of instances, again, the attributes of the property aren't really important. What tends to determine the price are the needs of the buyer or the seller. What about when there are extreme imbalances in supply or demand? So during this COVID crisis, what we saw almost universally across the country was that there was a shortage of supply, interest rates were very low, there was a lot of money out there, and it was driving prices up. So under those circumstances, people were paying very high prices for really, people were buying properties sight unseen. They were paying high prices for properties where the attributes of the property really weren't that important. What about when there are external market influences in play? So back during the 2008 recession, we saw people getting a lot of money out of the stock market and wanting to put it in real estate. And we saw a lot of buyers come down from New York with briefcases full of money and just paying really high prices for properties. And they really didn't care what the attributes of those properties were. So some cities have very low demand for either certain neighborhoods or housing types. There's actually some cities that have neighborhoods that are completely abandoned and nobody lives there. And when properties in those neighborhoods transact, typically those transactions don't have anything to do with the attributes of the property. So these are all examples of what happens and how common it can be for this relationship between price and attributes to be broken. And the problem is that if we apply an attribute-based method or process to properties that don't transact based on attributes, we're going to get it wrong 100% of the time. And yet, as assessors, we still have to value those properties. We want to believe, or we're trained to believe, that data will tell us everything. But there's a lot of variance in price that isn't captured in the data that is typically in our files. Some more about how models work. All models require a specification, which includes the form of the model. Is it an additive model, multiplicative model, gradient boosting, hybrid model, geographic weighted regression model? And it also includes the attributes that are going to be in the model and the ways that the data is transformed from its raw form into something that can be used in the model. Most models, no, not all models, but most models produce constants and coefficients. Constants are estimates of value for the most typical property. Coefficients are adjustments that are made to the constant for properties that are different than the most typical property. So let's look at an example of what a model produces. Here's a pretty typical model. And in this model, the constant is 12.183, and that's a log. So when we unlog that, that becomes $195,500. So you see there's a set of adjustments here for the building sizes, 3 different types of buildings, and lot sizes. There are adjustments for traffic. So we can see that a large major street with a lot of traffic is a downward adjustment, negative influence, whereas a quiet street is a positive adjustment. There are adjustments for different types of properties, because some types of houses are more in demand than others and will have premiums or penalties. There are adjustments for the condition of improvements, and this one figures prominently in almost every model. There are adjustments for locations or neighborhoods. And in this model, there are also adjustments for distance from desirable or undesirable features. So in this case, we're looking at parks, bridges, commercial corridors, and desirable neighborhood services. There are also adjustments in this model for a type of garage and for whether or not there's central air in the property. So each one of these attributes produces performance metrics for each adjustment. And these performance metrics tell us about the reliability and accuracy of the adjustment, the importance of each attribute, and whether any attributes are collinear with other attributes. There are also metrics, that are measures of central tendency and dispersion for the entire model that tell us how accurately and uniformly the model is producing values or predicting values. But let's consider, what are these adjustments and to what are they being applied? They don't exist in a vacuum. Each one is an adjustment to this and only this constant. Furthermore, these adjustments are taken as a group and are relative to each other. What happens if I were to remove one of these attributes from the model? Well, at least some, and possibly all, of the adjustments will change. What happens if I change the constant? If I define my base property, typical property differently? Well, in that case, probably all of these adjustments will change. So the model is estimating the contributory value of this particular set of attributes. Adding or removing attributes will redistribute essentially the same value across a different set of attributes. Therefore, these adjustments are only applicable to this model. I can't say that because having central air is an 8% adjustment in this model, that it's going to be 8% anywhere else. But now, isn't that what the guy with the horticultural model was doing? He was saying plant a tree anywhere and it raises your value by $125,000. Well, no, that's just not how it works. No two places are the same. Each market is unique with a different set of dynamics. The attributes that are significant in some markets will differ from one market to the next. So for instance, if I was to go to Douglas County in Nevada and Incline Village overlooks Lake Placid, what do you think would be one of the most important attributes in a model for Incline Village? Well, it would be whether or not you have a view of the lake. I mean, that's a hugely important attribute. But what if I drove up over Mount Rose, down into the Carson Valley, and I'm in another part of Douglas County that has no view of Lake Placid? What happens to that all-important view of the lake attribute? Well, it becomes completely insignificant. So even within the same county, attributes that are important in one submarket are completely irrelevant in another. The social and economic realities of each market will also introduce different dynamics. So let's consider, a Sunbelt city where a lot of people are selling houses in the colder climates and moving to someplace in Arizona or Florida. And you've got a growing population coming in with a lot of money. That's going to be a whole different scenario than if you were to try to apply that model to a Rust Belt city. Someplace where people there's a surplus in housing because people are leaving. One of the key attributes might be whether or not the main employer factory just shut down. So the life cycle of the area or the region may also present a unique set of circumstances. And in all these cases, the model specification and the constant and coefficients that result should be different and specific to each market. So now let's compare some different environments and how they can affect model building. Urban versus suburban versus rural. So the importance of parking, lot sizes, land value relative to building value will probably require an entirely different model specification for each of these kinds of scenarios. What about a warm versus a cold climate? Well, you'll see attributes like pools, garages, heating, central air, fireplaces. They're all going to behave differently, and the model specification may need to be different. A homogeneous versus non-homogeneous housing stock. When there's a lot of variety in the housing stock, the explanatory power of the model must be more specific to the attributes of each property. You may also need more observations in the file to have adequate representation of all properties. When you have homogeneous stock, not only do you need fewer observations, but there's less variance to explain, and more of your variance is going to shift away from the property itself and into the neighborhoods or locations. What about if you're looking at a growing municipality versus a declining municipality? When population is increasing, more housing is needed. Vacant land is in greater demand. We see more new construction, more rehabs. When population is declining, there may be a surplus of housing with limited new construction or demand for vacant land. Neighborhood effects and adjustments for time can become much more important. Large versus small. You're more likely to need different numbers of observations for a large community versus a small community. As size of inventory increases, there may be multiple time trends in play. So it may not all be moving in one time trend. Attributes may behave differently within subsets of the inventory. Larger inventories tend to have more variance, both in value and in the attributes that are present, that need to be explained by the models. Old versus young. Older municipalities tend to have more variance in building quality, condition of properties, and different types of properties. Neighborhoods tend to be less homogeneous because older buildings get torn down and replaced by newer buildings. So again, you have a scenario where there's going to be more variance that has to be explained by your models. Here's one a lot of people don't think about: data quality. It's much easier to build models with good data than with poor data. In fact, many modelers will tell you that you want to improve a model, just feed it better data. When data quality is poor, the model may need to include more sophisticated transformations or code to clean up data. Well, what about the CAMA system itself that you're drawing data from two different municipalities? The way that the data is stored in the system may have a lot to do with how the data can be transformed. Some systems only support certain types of models, or even support only certain types of transformations. So with all of these differences in dimensions of difference, there are a lot of possible combinations. Can we see how a model that's written for one combination of these circumstances just absolutely would not work for a different combination of circumstances? So given what we know, or what we've talked about so far, would a set of coefficients be portable from one market to another market? Absolutely not. Model coefficients should never be used outside of the model for which they were developed. So model coefficients are not portable. So that's no to borrowing adjustments for planting trees or rate per square foot adjustments. So if porting coefficients is a no, what about model specifications? There are a lot of model structures: additive, multiplicative, hybrid, nonlinear, random forest, gradient boosting, geographic weighted, ridge, lasso. Well, which is the best? Each one could be the best or the worst for any given circumstance. It really depends on the market. But you might be able to port a model specification if the markets are similar. I wouldn't port a model from a large your urban environment to a small rural one, but large urban to large urban, well, maybe. If the ported model will not be used for production, but just as a baseline or a template for additional testing and development, I mean, that's another possibility. So, I have this model that I use in my modeling workshop, and it's a pretty basic model, and it is possible to plug it a different database in and see how it works, just to get a feel for whether or not the data that you're using from another environment will even support models. So I've done this with data from other jurisdictions, put it into my very basic model just to see how it runs. And I know that even if I get good results, that's not what the final model is going to look like. But it does give me a baseline so that as I change things, one element at a time, I can see if it makes the model better or worse. And eventually I may end up with a completely different model through this step-by-step development. Now, another reason to do this is just to see if the data is going to support any kind of modeling. So I took my first modeling class in 1996, went running back to my office. I was all hot to build models. And I discovered very quickly that the data that we had just was not going to support regression models. It was just missing too many things. It was too inconsistent. There were We just didn't have the attributes that were significant. But over a period of years, we did a lot of data improvement projects, and after each one, I would try building models again, and we were clearly getting closer. And then eventually we got to the point where we could build models that were worthy of being in production. So using models to test the viability of data quality is a good option. All right, well, what about porting transformations? If we know that the form of the model and the attributes used are a good fit, can we assume that ported transformations will work? Well, no. The data transformations that give the best fit may need to vary from one market to another, even if the markets are similar. So let's look at some of these. Let's talk about categorical transformations, or transformations that result in a simple yes or no, or that group data into classes or categories. Things like quality of construction, or the condition of improvements, or whether or not there's air conditioning, which is usually just a simple yes or no. And garages are a good example of this. In some places, the type or size of garage doesn't matter, only if there is one or not. So any type of garage, attached, detached, built-in, or basement, or any size or number of spaces greater or equal to 1 would be a yes, and anything with no garage or 0 size or spaces would be a no. So this would be a simple binary transformation for garages. But if the type and or size of the garage matter, then a categorical transformation might be more useful. Each type, none, attached, detached, built-in, basement, could be treated as either a yes or no, or a number of spaces, 1, 2, more than 2. You might develop an adjustment per space for each category of garage. So this would be a typical categorical transformation. But if the size of the garage is really important, or if the data that's stored in your database is expressed as square footage of garage, you might transform garage size as a continuous variable, creating a rate per square foot per garage type, or maybe even transform square footage as a ratio of observed size to typical size, perhaps again for each type of garage. So which way is the best? Well, it really depends on how important garages are in general and how the data is stored in the files. By the way, can you think of an emerging trend that's going to make garages and off-street parking more important in the near future? Well, by 2035, GM will only be producing electric cars. And if you don't have off-street parking or a garage, and electric cars are becoming much more common everywhere, where are you going to charge your vehicle? So now let's look at another common transformation. Building square footage should be a significant attribute in every residential model. So here are some common ways to transform the data. Some people will transform it as a straight line per square foot starting at 0. Except there's no houses that are 1 square foot or 50 square feet. So how about a straight line from an intercept? Typically the smallest size house. But again, rates per square foot are rarely constant or linear. Now, if you have a county where there's not much variance in size, a straight line might do the trick. But for most counties where there's a lot of variance, go everything from 600 square feet to 10,000 square feet, a straight line's probably not going to work. So how about building a splined adjustment from either 0 or from an intercept? If you're using a multiplicative model, a logarithm will produce a curved line, which better captures economies of scale, either from 0 or from an intercept. You could use the median to produce one curve below and another curve above the median, or even multiple medians. Or you could adjust not on a rate per square foot basis at all, but based on the ratio of observed size to typical size. So there are a lot of choices, and each one of these is the best fit for one market and the worst fit for another. So there's a pretty good chance that a ported transformation from another market won't be the best fit for your market. So as a general rule of thumb, the more significant the attribute, the more nuanced the transformation will need to be. And the second rule of thumb is the more variance there is in the data, the more nuanced the transformation will need to be. So now we'll talk a little bit about using canned models. So why is this even a topic for discussion? Many practitioners seem to believe that you can embed a model specification into a pre-written package, run that model in any data set, and get production-worthy results. In my opinion, this viewpoint assumes that attributes always define market value and ignores the essential uniqueness of every market. Many large-scale AVMs use this approach, and for them, it's probably okay. The models that drive large-scale AVMs have different purposes than assessment models. Assessment models have to produce estimates for all properties, both sold and unsold, both common and uncommon. And these all end up in a bill that every property owner has to pay. AVMs have many uses, but not that. And AVMs do not carry the burdens of transparency or explainability. We could never even consider using a model if we couldn't explain how it works to a fourth grader. So assessors have and should have a higher standard of performance, as well as the need to meet publicly acceptable thresholds of both transparency and explainability. Some camera systems use this approach. They include models, pre-built models in their systems. But understand that when you're using a canned model, you're imposing the limits of the person who developed the model, who does not know your market as well as you do, on your performance. The camera system can't possibly know the unique features that must have explanatory power in your market. So for example, in our models for Philadelphia, we had our rate per square foot curves, or our building size curves. But in addition to that, we use 16 models for single family, for a model for every different area of the city. And in our market, in every part of the city, there was a right size property to buy and a wrong size property to buy, depending on the demographics of who lived there. So some communities favored the larger houses, some favored smaller houses, and they were different. So the building square foot curves would never pick that up, because there were some cases where walking down the same block, one side of the street might be small one-story twin houses or semi-detached houses that were maybe 600 to 900 square feet. Right across the street were two-story houses of twice the size. But not only would the twin ranchers sell for more per square foot, the sale prices, the raw sale prices, would actually be higher than the houses right across the street, all the same neighborhood influences, built at the same time, same condition, but the prices would actually be higher than the houses that were twice as big. Now clearly, your rate per square foot curve is not going to pick this up. So these size codes were an additional adjustment for building size. And what we found is in our 16 models, the combination of what was the premium and what was the penalty, they were different in almost all of these models. So there's no way that a camera system could have understood that and compensated for that. So I'm not speaking against the camera systems here. Many jurisdictions do not have the resources to build their own models. So having a prepackaged model in the camera system offers a good alternative. But even if your camera system includes canned models, you have other options. So you may start by running the CAN model inside the CAMA system and then trying to build a model outside of the CAMA system and see which one works better. Compare performance. If the CAN model gives the same results, well, great. But if not, you could try to develop and run the model outside of the system and then import the constants and coefficients back into the system and use the system to project values. Another option is to use the models to project the values outside of the system. Go all the way through the value projection and just import the values back into the system. And yet another thing you could do is to replicate the model specification and all of the transformations in the CAMA system so that the model can be run completely within the system. And there are modules and add-ons that will assist you in this process. So in mass appraisal, we are trying to replicate a very complex human behavior. It's a human behavior that's both complex and yet very simple. It's complex in that we have created a plethora of sophisticated methods to try to replicate it. And yet it's simple enough that even Gomer here can tell if a property is overpriced or a good deal. That's if he knows, if he's a local and he knows his market. And that's nothing against Gomer. But have you ever seen a home buyer? You ever seen one stand in the living room of a house they were thinking about buying, whip out their computer and do some high-level math or run an algorithm to figure out what they were willing to pay for the property? Of course not. If they're knowledgeable about the market, they're doing a much simpler calculation. Now, what if Stella just got off the bus from Chadron, Nebraska, or Kevin just got off the plane from Philly? What does Gomer know that we don't? Much of what makes a market unique isn't captured in the common or standard data or attributes. It's something that has to be created. We call this process feature engineering. And in our Philadelphia models, we relied on at least 4 engineered features. So I mentioned size codes, but we also had one for the time period in which a property was built. We had properties that were built back in 1650 that are still in play today, and we have properties that were built last week. So that's a long continuum if we try to look at age of a property as a continuous variable. So what we did was divide the history of the city into 7 or 8 time periods. And we assigned houses by the year they were built into those time periods and used those time periods as our models. And it turned out to work much, much better than trying to use age of a property as a variable. We also have certain property types that are really in demand and others that are really unfavorable. And our CAMA system would have the number of stories and the basic design of the property, but trying to develop coefficients for those 2 variables did not work as well as bringing them together to define specific types of properties, because it was those combinations. It was the combination that was important, not specifically. You could never get it from looking at the number of stories or the style or design of the property. So that's another example. Another one we used was the way that we approached central air. We knew for the vast majority of our unsold properties, I don't know was the answer. We have yes, no, and I don't know. And so it became important. We couldn't live with, can't model I don't know. So we had to convert the yeses and the nos to something. So we figured, well, you know, if the property was built before 1950 and 1970 and we don't know, it's probably a no. If the property was built after 1970 and we don't know, it's probably a yes. And when we ran our first models, we were getting an adjustment for air conditioning that was about 8%. And we were getting feedback from our appraisers that that number was just too big. And what we saw was that with the newer construction, they were getting the premium for being new construction, and they were also getting the premium for air conditioning, which was really common in all of those houses. So they were really getting double dipped. So when we went to this method of saying, well, we're going to look at anything built before 1970 having air conditioning is a positive, and anything built after 1970 not having air conditioning is negative. When we did that transformation and applied it in all of our models, it cut the adjustment for air conditioning about in half, and it turned out to be just about the right calibration for what how air conditioning affected our market. So those are 4 examples of things that no camera system could have predicted or would have been able to create into a prepackaged model. And yet, without those variables, without those attributes, our markets just simply were not understandable. So feature engineering goes beyond mere transformation, and it's probably needed to capture some peculiar local essence in just about every market. And these are the things that Gomer implicitly knows. So, what is the secret sauce? The secret sauce is the understanding of what makes your market unique. And it boils down to the attributes that are significant in your market and how they behave, and the data engineering that it takes to capture the essence of your uniqueness, and an understanding of the circumstances or submarkets under which the relationship between price and attributes breaks down. Because if we try to apply our understanding of price structure based on attributes to those properties, we're going to get it wrong every time. And in some cases, that could be significant. If attributes behave the same way in all markets, model specifications and data transformations would be portable. But they don't. So no one-size-fits-all solution is going to fit the bill. Model coefficients, again, never portable. And to reiterate, model specifications and data transformations may be portable, but usually only as a starting point for further development, not for production purposes. And it's really only by understanding our secret sauce that we can predict values and provide assessment equity across the entirety of our property inventories. So why do we do it? Why do we try to make models portable? Well, to some degree, it's just human nature. We want solutions. How many of you feel some level of discomfort when you don't have an answer to a question or a problem? To what degree are you uncomfortable with? I don't know. So it's natural to want a solution. And it's natural to want to take a tool that someone else has developed and use it. Why reinvent the wheel? It's easy. And it sure would be convenient to write one model and use it over and over again in a bunch of different markets and circumstances. And there's a natural human tendency to believe in magic, magical thinking again, even when we know there's no such thing. Many jurisdictions lack the technical skill and expertise to custom build their own models, and they may not have the budget or resources to use a consultant. Now, in my opinion, by giving back less in appeals and complaints, custom-built models pay for themselves in the performance gains realized by using them in pretty short order. Still, many of us may be limited to using canned models. It just might be the best you can do. But this should not be confused with because we can. If you choose to use a canned model, who's going to prove that you're wrong? Who out there will have the resources and know-how to show that your process is lacking? In most places, the assessor is presumed to be correct until they're proven wrong. So if you did it, you can get away with it. But because we can do a thing doesn't mean that we should do a thing. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, but what's our responsibility as public servants? We have a duty as keepers of the public trust to provide the best possible service to our constituents. We have to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards of conduct, practice, and performance. We should not look to take the easy ways out. We have to commit to doing the hard work, even if that yields only marginally better results. So in summary, I generally do not believe that models are portable. And if you're thinking about adopting ported or canned models, I hope after hearing this presentation that you will reconsider. Find your secret sauce and use it to improve your valuation practice. And so ends my cautionary tale. That's all I have for today. Please feel free to send me any questions or comments. Direct any correspondence to kevin@keenmac.com. Thank you very much.